Hi, welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to do a short demonstration of this painting. Okay, well we'll start by wetting down the paper. I want to have a nice sheen of water on the paper. Not worried about going over where the mountains are going to go or the hills are going to go. And again, I'm not bothered about going over the trees. We're just trying to achieve a nice even covering of water on the paper. Get it good and wet so that we can work wet in wet before it gets a chance to dry. I'll also be doing, once I've done the sky, I'll be doing the water, so we'll prep that as well, leaving an area at the distant shoreline because I want to try and pick up a nice bit of light there. What I'm doing here is I'm sort of looking sideways and checking that I can see a nice even sheen on the areas that I want to be wet, which is across the top of those hills and that shoreline. I use the White Knight professional watercolour paints. I'll use two blues in the sky. This is called bright blue, which is like a cerulean blue, and also I'll use the aquamarine blue, which is a much warmer blue. I like to mix my colours on a ceramic palette. I can see exactly what the colour is going to look like then when I apply it to the paper. So I'm just getting myself a nice amount to work with. You don't want to be running out of a colour. We're going to have a simple sky for this painting, working down from the top and then coming across diagonally, leaving a few gaps, spaces, and making the wash get lighter as we work down the paper. We use the same colour for the water, leaving an area from the distant shoreline paler than the rest. Now we need to leave that to dry. I'll use the hairdryer to speed up the process and mix up some colour for the next part of the process. For the distant hills we need a range of greys. So to create the greys we blend together the blues that are on the palette with a bit of burnt sienna, produce a nice range of greys that we can lay in the lighter ones for the distant hills and bluer grey for the hills which are closer to us. As I get close to the shoreline, the distant shoreline, I need to indicate there are some buildings, a small village or a town at the shoreline. And we do this by just putting in a few marks to fool the eye into thinking that that's what is actually at that point. Now we darken that mixture by adding in some more blue, ready to paint in the hills which will be in the foreground. When I want to add texture to the surface, I lay the brush on the side so I can use the full length of the bristles. As the brush meets the paper, the texture of the cold pressed paper picks up the pigment and creates that nice texture look. The light direction for this painting is top left, so it's shining down from the top left and across the painting. So I lift out a little bit of the colour on the left hand side of that foreground hill. So that's all the hills painted, both foreground and distant. Now we'll leave that to dry. While that's drying, we'll mix up some more colour. We will use some Indian gold, which is like quinacridone gold. We'll also use some burnt sienna. My palette camera here appears to not be quite lined up on the palette correctly. Sorry about that. We'll also replenish the blues on the mixing area. That's the bright blue, the cerulean blue. And we'll get some more of the ultramarine blue. Mixing together the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna can give you a nice dark brown according to the proportions you mix, obviously. We put plenty of burnt sienna in with the ultramarine blue. You'll get a nice dark colour for the tree trunks and the branches, etc. And that can be varied according to how much you dilute down the mixture. Finally, if we mix a bit of scarlet red on the palette and bring in some of the blues that are laying around here, we get a nice reddy grey, which is also quite useful in the next part of the picture we're going to paint. Okay, now that's dry, it's time to start working on the trees. Okay, using a dark mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, we can start to lay in the trunks of the smaller trees, which are between this large one and the shoreline. You can see here that the mixture I've made isn't quite dark enough, and will of course dry much lighter than that. So I will have to come back over this with a darker mixture. Now, as we lay in the branches, which I try and paint in the direction they grow, we gradually lift the brush up as we get towards the ends of each of the branches. So it's almost like a flicking motion to produce the very thin top to the branches. I always enjoy painting trees. I find it very relaxing. Just putting in the little branches and gradually forming the shape of the tree. I suppose I'm as mad as a hatter, but I do enjoy it. That one got a little bit thick, but it'll be covered by the foliage. You won't really notice that when it's finished. You can cover a multitude of mistakes with what comes after. Put a bit of colour on that trunk. I haven't quite decided how I want to form that trunk yet. But, so it's time to mix up some greens. So we bring a bit of yellow in. Mix it in with the blue and a little bit of burnt sienna or burnt umber, varying shades of green. This is a bit weak at the moment. Just darken it off a bit. And then I'm adding some olive green into the mix. That's it, starting to look the sort of colour that I want. Now we can start to add the foliage. I'm using the brush on its side, so I'm using the full length of the bristles, touching the paper, and the texture of the paper is picking up the paint from the brush and dropping it on. It's a good way of doing the texture on a tree foliage. The quinacridone gold mixed in there a little bit to give me a light side to the tree on this left hand side. The right hand side of the tree will end up darker. I'll put a bit of umber in there and a bit of burnt sienna and a bit more quinacridone gold or Indian gold to give me those nice light textured side of the tree. And then just get some really broken foliage around the end and start to put a bit of foliage texture over the top of what was already there. Here I work the foliage colour into the bush on the shoreline and in behind these trees, starting to bring a bit of colour into the foreground. Start to work a bit more colour into the foreground. Some a bit of quinacridone gold or Indian gold mixed in with the greens that I've got on the palette. Starting to put in a bit of burnt sienna, a bit of burnt umber. Now we can work on this main tree trunk, giving it its first layer of colour. Darker on the right hand side, lighter on the left. Seat it into the ground with some roots. Darken that right hand edge a little bit and then leave that to dry while we work on some more of the foreground foliage up to that near shoreline. Just trying to lay down some background colours for the foreground. Strange statement to make. the first wash colours for the foreground. It's probably a better way of describing it. Indicate a broken edge against the water there. All this is foundation. We will be coming back over it again with darker colours later. Reinforce the branches in the trees with the darker tone. Slightly thicker mixture. This is the intermediate stage on the trees before we come back in, once this is dry, to add another layer of foliage over the top of what's already there to build up the foliage in the tree. Again, darken these tree trunks. And now start to lay in a darker blue, which is the ultramarine, mixed with a bit of bright blue, onto the water. The texture of the paper is causing that sheen, which is nice, without having to do very much work. A few more darker areas over the top. And then back into the foreground foliage again. Establish that beach area there. A few more dark burnt sienna, burnt umber type colours into the foreground. Work it all in, gradually building it up and building it up layer on layer as soon as the layer underneath is dry enough to allow us to do that. While that dries, we will give the distant shoreline a bit of attention, reinforce it a bit where the water meets the shoreline, give an indication of that. Try and keep it horizontal and make it a little bit darker than what it's sitting on top of. Put some gaps in between the buildings, some dark marks, just to fool the eye into accepting that in the distance we have buildings sitting on the shoreline. Just dab that out a little bit. Okay, that's pretty much there. Yeah, we're good on that. Now, taking a flat brush, we can start to introduce some shadow areas to the right of this large tree trunk, because the light's coming top left, and put more shadows in behind these tree trunks. Just blend it in slightly. Get some shadow on the right hand side of that bush, extending out. And then we can lay in some rocks, put a bit of interest in the water here. Some rocks just protruding above the surface. Flat brush is quite good for these kind of shapes. Reinforce that shadow. Feather it out a bit. Flat brush is also good for flicking up and giving you a grass-like edge to your paint. It's coming together quite nicely. Just working it in a mixture of greens and browns, with a bit of blue to darken it. It looks a little bit strange at the moment. It'll look okay as it dries, and as we introduce more texture on this side of it. Back to this tree trunk again. I'm trying to get the shape of the tree. I'm trying to just damp that right edge and lay in some dark colour on that right edge. And then with a clean brush, coax that across to the left hand side so that we get a rounded trunk to the tree, showing the light on the left hand side. That works quite well. And work that in. Okay. Now we can scrumble, as they say, some colour into that area on the left. A mixture of colours here. Don't make it flat. Try and get texture with greens and browns. Vary what you're putting down on the paper. I'm going to use a lift out brush to lift some colour out of the left hand side of the tree trunk, because I want it lighter. I want the left hand side lighter and the right hand side darker. With a tissue, I'm lifting off the paint that I've loosened with the lift out brush. Using the same brush, I'm lifting out the edge of the distant hill to soften it. I really want those edges in the distance to be softened. So clean water. The lift out brush is got fairly stiff bristles, and just helps you to move the paint on the paper. This is a piece of magic eraser which I've wetted, and that also helps to lift out colour. Really working on that distant hill edge. That's looking better. And a bit inside the hill as well. If you lift out too much, you can always come back and put some back in again. But it's important to get these edges looking right. So now the trees are dry, the foliage is dry, we can use a sponge to lay in a much darker mixture of green, using Russian green and olive green and a bit of ultramarine blue. We can lay in some darker foliage over the top. Sponge is quite useful for doing this, providing you use a very, very light pressure with the sponge. If you hit the paper too hard with the sponge, you'll leave a lot of paint behind, and that's not what you're trying to do. So I'm mixing up some darker mixture. Here we go. Just very lightly dab that on to build up the foliage in the trees, like that. Working more on the shadow side of the tree. Okay, I'm happy with the trees and the foliage. Now we need to work on the foreground beach area. Lay in some Indian gold to give it a foundation. To that we can add some burnt sienna, a bit of warmth, and we can add in some burnt umber for texture. There we go. And then work those darks into the foreground grasses and bushes to try and finish off the foreground. Okay, I think we'll call that done. I've signed it. Thank you for watching. I hope you've learned a little bit from this very simple demonstration. I will endeavour to make my next demonstration a bit better, a bit more polished. Please press like, subscribe, and the bell icon if you want to know when I release the next video. Thank you. Bye for now.